Good morning, everyone. Who's a composer? Any composers? Okay, a few people are going to understand what I'm talking about. I'm Kejero. I'm going to skip the introduction because we just don't have time for it. I write music. And I've developed a music system for Starship Troopers. It's a video game. I'm going to give you a very condensed explanation of how I implemented that system. I was going to make a joke about how I've never watched the original movie, thinking it's about people who like to smell each other's armpits. Unfortunately, I don't have time for that joke. Or how we made a game based on that premise. The game is a real-time strategy game where you lead a bunch of troopers in a war against alien bugs on an alien planet. What's adaptive music? On my website, there's a few hours of video content where I explain most of the common adaptive music techniques. You can go there, not now. In one sentence, it's solving the problem of transition. So how do you move from one piece of music to another piece of music? Or how do you change the feeling of a piece of music? And how do you do that in a way that it sounds seamless? I'm going to focus on a solution for orchestral music and for games that are trying to tell some kind of story. So I'm not going to try to solve every problem in adaptive music. Everything that I'm going to say is in the context of this very focused solution. I'll be using some words that maybe you might not understand, maybe because I made them up, some of them. You can see a glossary of those words on this URL, kejero.com/ADC. Let's start with some of the basics. So we have typically vertical and horizontal techniques. A vertical technique is where you change the orchestration of a piece of music, and we typically do this by adding or removing layers of instruments. There's also submixes. I'm going to skip that for now. Typically, this is done by fading in a layer or fading it out. I think that usually sounds horrible, again, within the context of orchestral music. A horizontal technique is where you jump from one piece of music to another piece of music, or you jump from a position in a piece of music to another position in maybe the same piece of music. That's what I call a jump. That's a horizontal movement. There are different ways of achieving that. My favorite way is by using segments. That means that you record the cue. Cue is what we professionals call a piece of music. You record it in several segments, and each segment can be a few measures of music. And the secret sauce is in the tail of every audio segment. That's where you make sure to record the reverb tail of the orchestra. And so if you have a system that then shadows different segments one after the other sequentially, that reverb tail is really going to glue together those segments. So you don't have that weird cutoff when you instantly jump to another segment. Vertical is typically faster because you're just limited by the speed of the fade that you use. If you use a fade time of just 1 second, then that gives you an agility of 1 second, and that's pretty good. With a horizontal approach, especially if you're using segments, you're limited by the length of the segments because it has to play out. But the result is more musical because you don't have to use fades. I prefer to use a vertical technique when the intensity of the music needs to be changed. When I want to make a more dramatic change, something that supports things that happen in the story, or you move from one area to another area, that's where I prefer to use a horizontal technique. Those are not rules. That's just the way that I typically approach these problems. Right, so in Terran Command, you have a lot of quick, short little battles, and that requires a lot of intensity changes. And that is typically achieved with vertical changes. At the same time, we also have story-driven missions. You move from one area to the next and to the next, and that really demands a horizontal approach. The music itself is inspired by the music from the movie. It's symphonic. There's a lot of key modulations, tempo changes, etc. and that really asks for a horizontal approach. I don't want to have any fades, that's horizontal. And when there's a phrase playing, a melody, I really want that to play out. I don't ever want to hear a melody fading out. So that is typically a horizontal approach as well. But that game really wants that fast agility. And usually that is achieved with vertical techniques. So we needed something hybrid. I call it BAM. And at the core, BAM is a horizontal system. So I have recorded the music in separate segments, but I also recorded every segment in multiple versions. I call these submixes. And that allows me to have different intensity versions of every segment. So I could have low intensity, medium, high intensity. Could be more or less intensities depending on the cue. And every segment is just one measure in length. With a regular piece of music, that gives me an agility of about 2 seconds, right? A measure lasts about 2 seconds. You might think that sounds like a lot of work, and it is. There's a little bonus. While you're recording all these little segments, you will catch little mistakes. These always happen when you're working on a dense soundtrack like that. So that's a nice little bonus. But yeah, this is by far the most time-consuming part of the entire process. Really, the only thing you can do is try to optimize that workflow. That's something you learn as you do it. It's also a matter of knowing your digital audio workstation. All the shortcuts, all the functions in the system, it really pays to know those little time savers. And it really helps if you develop your own software system, because it means that once I'm done creating those little segments, that I have a system, I can just give it those audio segments, and it knows what to do with that. I still have to do a minimal amount of configuration. I have to provide some metadata, but really the system really takes care of most of the work. So let's quickly revisit the goals that we had. I have 2 seconds of agility, and that proved to be quick enough for the game. It's story-driven. Well, the system is mostly horizontal, so that works. I can change literally every aspect of the music because I can just jump from one piece of music to a completely different piece of music. So anything can technically be changed with a horizontal approach. So that works. I don't want to have any fading. It's a horizontal approach. And when there's a phrase playing, I want that to play out. That I'm going to have to go a little bit deeper into that one. So typically when you have those segments, you record that. If you look at the green one, that's the first measure, and you record the reverb tail inside that audio segment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to allow, let's say the French horns are playing a 4-measure melody. I'm going to allow that entire melody to play out in the first segment. So the system thinks it's just 1 measure of music, but in the tail of that audio segment is actually 3 more measures of actual content. The 3 next segments are simply not going to contain any French horns. Problem solved. Well, not exactly. We still need a system that can then figure out if that melody is playing, which other segments from completely different cues can I place underneath that. Not everything will work. If there are different keys involved, different chord progressions, or what happens if I'm playing that French horn phrase and I jump to a destination segment that also contains a phrase. How is that going to sound? It might sound great, it might sound horrible. So we really need a system that can take care of that problem for us. Okay, that's enough boring talk. Let's give a little demonstration first of the actual solution. right, so the biggest problem to solve are those phrases. Let's first look at how we handle a phrase during an intensity change. So that would be a vertical change. In every segment that contains a phrase, in this example, again, that's the green one. Let's say we have those French horns playing. That phrase, they might perform that differently at a lower intensity than on the highest intensity. Or it could be an entirely different phrase, or it could be no phrase at all. Usually what I would do is, well, at the very least, I make sure that every segment, remember that's just a measure of music, is always in the same key. So that's not going to change between intensity changes. And typically I would also make each phrase the same length. That's not a technical limitation, but it just makes for better transitions between those intensities. I also have a quick example of that. So a more challenging problem is a phrase during a jump. What happens if those French horns are playing a phrase and I jump to a destination that also contains another phrase? Well, if those keys match, that might sound all right. And if it's performed by the strings, that might sound fine too. If that other phrase was performed by French horns as well, that would probably sound a little bit weird. So how do you design a system that knows when a phrase is going to work with another phrase and when it's not? You don't. Keep it simple. You could try to come up with a system that tries to solve that problem, but I promise it's going to get very complicated very quickly. So BAM simply does not allow more than one phrase to play at the same time. But what happens if the key changes in a phrase? Because remember, I wanted the right music that has a lot of key modulations. And if I have a phrase that lasts 4 measures, I don't want to be restricted so that I could only write that entire phrase in one key. Again, I kept it very simple there. As far as BAM is concerned, every phrase is just in one key. So if the phrase starts in D minor, BAM thinks it's just in D minor. Even if it modulates to G major or A major, whatever, BAM doesn't care, BAM doesn't know. So you might think, well, then it's possible that that phrase is playing and BAM starts shadowing segments in D minor, even though there's a melody playing in a different key. Yeah, but this doesn't happen very often. If you think about it, a horizontal jump is a dramatic change. It's not something that happens all the time. So like within a level, you might have 5 or 6 times that you jump to another piece of music. So a jump itself doesn't happen all that often. Also, the majority of phrases are actually in one key. There are with modulations, but the majority of them are without. And then even if it happens, it might just sound fine, and it often actually does, even if those keys don't match. So it's just not worth worrying about. Here's an example of my testing software. So how does BAM know which segment is in which key? I tell it. That's some of the stuff that I still have to do as a composer as part of the configuration. So I just tell it, this segment starts in this key and it wants to go to any of these keys. I do that simply by adding tags in the file names. It's a very simple system. And I also mark which segments that I think are suitable as a key destination. So not every position in every queue will sound good when you jump to it. And again, you could come up with a system that figures out from all the metadata which segments would be suitable as destinations, but I figured it's so much easier and actually a lot less work if I make that decision myself. Because it's also a musical decision very often, and well, good luck coming up with a system that can figure that one out. I also limited the amount of keys that I used. So actually every cue in the entire soundtrack uses just these 4 keys. And every cue has a section of at least a few measures in each of those 4 keys. That's not a technical limitation, that's just something that saves me work. It also proves to be enough keys to provide for plenty of modulations and variety. And I know that at any point in any queue, I will be able to jump to any other queue because there will be, at the very least, matching keys. Now, that said, most of the queues are also going to contain plenty of measures that are actually not in those keys. Those are their standard keys, but when I'm writing the music, I don't want to be limited by that. So if I end up in another key, so be it. If BAM wants to jump during one of those segments in G minor, it's just going to wait. That's the default behavior. I can change the urgency as well. I'm not going to get into that in detail now. The default behavior is it just waits until the next measure. If the next measure allows to go to one of those keys, then it will just jump at that point. And I lied, not all the cues are just in those keys. There are actually some cues that are in completely different keys. And for those, I just write a dedicated transition segment. That's just a segment where I write the music so it modulates from one of the standard keys to whichever key I need. or the other way around. So yeah, sometimes you will still need some transition segments for those exceptions. That is if there is no matching key or the tempo is different. If the signature is different, that's usually not much of a problem. Imagine going from 4 beats in a measure to 3 beats if the tempo is the same. That'll usually sound just fine. It might sound a bit weird though if there is a phrase playing in 4/4 and you cue up some 6/8 measures after that. That might sound a little bit weird. In that case, you might consider writing some dedicated transition segments as well. But very importantly, these segments are always selected automatically by BAM. I do mark them as a transition segment, but BAM just looks at the metadata and then knows this is suitable at this moment in time to use as a transition. I have an example of that too. Segways, that's a word that I made up. Well, I didn't make up the word, but in this context. It's exactly the same as a transition segment, except that it is explicitly requested by the game. So it's never automatically selected. So imagine that an event takes place in the game, and the game asks BAM, play me some music that sounds like surprise. What that sounds like will depend on the current music state. So it'll depend on the cue that's playing. At nighttime, I might have some choir music, and when I cue a surprise segue, that might sound different from a surprise segue during a more action-oriented daylight mission. Segues can be used as a transition to another cue, to another music state, but you can also just stay in the same state. And I wrote all of those segues in each of the 4 standard keys, and that makes it very easy for the system to transition to a segue at any point in time. Here's an example of how segues can really help the storytelling in the game.
Sir, glad to hear your voice, Colonel. I knew you'd pull through.
I always do.
What's your status? Command's upset the advance is behind schedule.
There's not gonna be any advance. Do they have any idea what happened down here?
Intel is still sketchy. Only a few of the drop teams have radioed us so far.
A unit has been promoted, sir.
Command has ordered a general retreat. Get your people ready for evacuation.
What about the other squads?
A lot of them are not going to make it. We have their locations. But heavy plasma bug fire means Command can't risk the shuttles to make pickup. Your people are the lucky ones.
Negative. We're not leaving. The MI leaves no trooper behind. Send over the coordinates of those plasma bugs. We'll take them out and clear a path for the shuttles.
That's a big call to make on your own, Colonel. There's a hell of a lot of bugs guarding them. If this goes wrong...
Wouldn't have it any other way.
Dropships on standby, ready for orders.
Countdown cues. I'm just going to play the clip because otherwise we might not make it. Maybe very quickly, we have a bunch of timers in the game. Typically, they just lead to a large wave attack. So it's a way of building tension and also a way of telling the player to be ready at a specific moment in time. And I want to have a system that builds music to a certain climax. I'm going to skip this one. Real quickly, we do have some sections in the game that lasts maybe 10, sometimes 20 minutes maybe. That's where we want to use a playlist with different segments, with different cues that are shuffled. They play for a certain amount of time. But the really interesting decision to make there is when you allow the system to make a jump. Remember, a jump is a dramatic change in the music, so it has to be justified somehow. And if you think about it, when the intensity drops to 0, it probably means we were just in a battle. Could be a small battle, could be a larger battle. But that would justify jumping to another piece of music. If you think of the opposite, nothing's happening in the game, and timer runs out on a cue in a playlist, and it decides to jump to another piece of music, the player might think, oh, something happened here. I need to look out for something, when really nothing happened. We just wanted to bring some variety. So that's why I gave BAM some rules for deciding when to make a jump inside a playlist. No, actually, I do have time for that. Go back, go back. Right, this is just a clip. This demonstrates how BAM sends information, how the game sends information to BAM. At every frame, it tells BAM what's the desired music state and what's the desired intensity. And here's a short visualization of that.
Sir, roger that.
Sensors are picking up new bug hive activity.
Yes, sir. Squad, ready for yes, sir. Standing by. Affirmative. Sir. Roger that. Yes, sir.
Sir, additional supplies are now available. A unit has been promoted, sir. A unit has been promoted, sir.
Sir. Listen up. This way. Tell us what to do. Engineers, follow me. Awaiting orders. Roger that. Engineers report. Roger that.
So if it hadn't told you that it jumped to another queue right there, you probably would never have noticed. That's kind of the point. BAM can also talk to the game. This is not used a ton in Starship Troopers, but we do use it to sync up some animation. Just quickly going to show how that works when you lose.
Package is down. We've failed to extract the officer.
It feels so much better to lose if it's in sync with the music, isn't it? All right, so how do I decide what's a good transition segment? I'm going to give the quick version, I guess. Avoid phrases. So the system already avoids phrases if there's another phrase playing, but it doesn't hurt to allow for some additional time. If a phrase is playing during a jump, allow it some time to settle. Not just finish, but also just settle. Give it a few measures of music before you start a completely new ID, a new musical ID. Remember that a jump is already a pretty dramatic change. If you immediately start a new melody as well, it might add to that, and you typically don't want that. If you do want a dramatic change in the music, that's typically where I will be using segways. I make my phrases about 4 measures in length. If you make them longer, you reduce the agility. If you imagine 6 measures that are all in D minor, that means that if we jump during the first measure, BAM now has to find a section of 5 measures in D minor without any phrase in the destination queue. It might not find that, and it has to wait till the next measure or the one after that. If you make it shorter, you might risk that the phrase doesn't sound complete. It might sound interrupted, and I generally try to avoid that as well. If you add those together, I make sure that I have at least 3 measures in every key, in every queue. Not only does that allow for jumps to happen during a phrase, if my phrase is normally around 4 measures, then even if it jumps after that first measure, I know there will be room in the next queue to play out that phrase, but also not even thinking about adaptive music at all. it might be a good idea to just allow the music to breathe. You don't need to have a melody playing all the time in your music. But sometimes you do want that. I mean, when I'm writing a music, I don't really think about it. It's in the back of my head, but I just focus on writing the music first before I start worrying about everything else. And it might happen that I have a section in E flat minor, and it's all phrases. I don't have any section without phrases. Well, it's usually pretty simple. You just take one of those sections and you just re-record it without a phrase. And then I just mark it as a transition phrase, a transition segment. And BAM will know, okay, that's not a segment that belongs in the cue itself, but it can be used to transition to this cue. And if that doesn't work, you can just write a transition segment. That's just one measure or a few measures for that specific purpose. If you have a segue that does not transition to another cue, so it stays in the same music state, I always make sure to put a key modulation in there. And the reason's this. If you jump from that E flat minor to the segue, and the segue stays in E flat minor, at the end of the segue, it's now looking for a destination in the same cue we just came from in E flat minor. And it might happen that there's only one suitable segment, and we just heard that 15 seconds ago. And that might sound, if you're playing, like, okay, we just played a little piece of music, and now we restarted the same cue. I want to avoid that, and an easy way to do that is just making sure that it never goes back to where we just came from. So changing the key to D minor will make sure that I will jump to another section. If you know music theory, then you know that the scale of A minor shares all the same notes with C major. You might think, well, that makes it very easy to transition from a cue that's in A minor to a cue that's in C. I even tried to teach BAM some basic music theory to make those transitions automatic. I was wrong about that assumption. It usually sounds like crap. Really, the only way that I found to make that sound good is if you've actually written it that way. The secret sauce is in the tail. Even if it's just a reverb tail, don't be afraid to make it long enough, because that is the glue. And if the glue is, you cannot perceive it at all, then it's kind of pointless putting it in there. It might still sound cut off when you shuttle another segment. So just make sure to make those tails long enough. Don't be afraid of it. This is an important one. Yeah. I think of every segment as a complete piece of music with a beginning and an ending. And ideally, every segment can start a piece of music and it can also end it. If you cannot do both, prioritize the ending. It's much more important than starting off in a good way. The most important decision you have to make there is where do you place a note? And you have to ask that question for every single instrument in the orchestra. For example, with the timpani, I made sure that the timpani is always used as a lead-in. And on the first beat of a measure, the timpani is always performing something. Well, if it is performing at all. And I make sure that almost every other percussion instrument is used to punctuate the ending of a measure. And I do that on the first beat of the next measure. And that makes sure that when you end that segment, it sounds like some kind of conclusion. But I make sure that I'm consistent so that when I shuttle different segments after the other that were meant to be played in sequence, that I don't have the same instrument overlapping notes that were not supposed to overlap. So here's a quick example of how the timpani has a very short lead-in, and it plays on that first note. It doesn't play on the last note, which again is the first beat of the next measure. But all the other percussions, they do not perform on the first beat, but they do punctuate that first beat of the next measure. that was amazing. Rhythmic elements. Imagine that you have a section where the strings or the cello are performing some kind of ostinatos. And you just start that section, you're in the first measure, and then you make a jump to a new cue. Having that rhythmic information, which kind of stands out, if that just lasts for a single measure, that's going to sound a little strange. If you make that 2 measures, that suddenly sounds a lot more intentional. So I make sure that when I have information like that, musical IDs like that, that stand out, I make sure that I always group them in at least 2 measures, so that you never have that single measure of musical ID that then suddenly disappears again. So that was 2 measures, and the first measure was the actual measure, but the cello continued playing that ostinato for 2 measures, and then the second measure after that. Well, and percussion and everything. When you have a very long section, that's performed by like a synth pad, or it could be strings or whatever. I just record it completely first, and then I cut it into little segments. The problem is that you want those to crossfade. That's going to sound fine if you fade them in and out, but you have to be careful of phasing. There's an easy way around that, is if it's just one note, all you have to do is make sure that every second segment there is just shifted a little bit to the left or to the right. That makes sure that you do not have any phasing issues. If you know what I'm talking about, then great, and if you don't, I'm really sorry. Another trick that's very often used in orchestral music is beefing up the sounds with some synths. The one thing to watch out for is that during a transition, those are not ever sounded like separately, so that they don't stand out, at least if that's not the kind of music that you're writing. So conclusions. I always start with the music in mind. I keep it simple, and for God's sake, fades must die. All right, that was my talk. If you want to know more, there's a ton of stuff on my website. There's a lot more stuff coming on my website. We have 3 minutes for questions. Otherwise, I will also be around. So, anyone?
So what's the tech behind this? What did you write this in?
What's the tech behind it? Yes. I looked into using something like Juice, but we just had 9 months when I got signed on. And I'd never used anything like that, so I went for a quick and dirty solution, which is just using the Unity API. So the game's written in Unity, and I just wrote some C# code, because that's what I've been doing my entire life. Well, my entire professional life. Those 9 months became 2.5 years, but yeah, well, I'm not gonna change that idea. So it turned out to be just fine. It doesn't have to do much more than play audio.
The entire UI that we saw was also Unity.
Yes, the entire UI was Unity.
Curious about, see, I noticed like a lot of it, like when we say adaptive, it sort of feels more reactive to things that are happening in the game. But I was wondering if there was instances where the music is like foreshadowing something. Maybe there's like there's a potential enemy or like something that could happen, and then there's like.
Yeah, so the question is if we don't just use it as a reactive tool, but also for foreshadowing. Yeah. Now, the story itself, I have to admit, I don't think the devs will be angry when I say that the story is not great. But yeah, there are definitely some sections where I do foreshadow some major events and using some maybe horror tropes where the music dips, providing some tension before everything explodes or whatever. So yeah, I definitely approached it like a movie score, and that's also the whole point of a system like this. Yeah.
So when you're composing music, is that the time when you're also thinking of how you split the loops into different measures? Because it's a very creative process, like when you think of a melody and all that.
Yeah, so the question is, how much do I think about all the technical stuff when I'm writing the music? I try not to, but at the same time, you have to do a little bit. And yeah, I can speak for this particular system, and that's very easy to do because I know exactly what it does, how to use it, what the strengths are, and what the weaknesses. There are no weaknesses. But yeah, you definitely always have to keep it in mind that to a certain extent, but you really don't want to. And usually, like I said, it's in the back of my mind, but I'm not going to let myself restricted by it. And in fact, because the deadlines were extended a few times, I could actually afford to just focus on the music and then figure out later how I was going to implement it and come up with some solutions in the software itself, if that was necessary. Right. Yes.
Do you have to work with the dialogue at all? Because sometimes it's a very dramatic music change the dialogues.
Yeah, so during a lot of dialogue scenes, we use segways to underscore the dialogue. We also made sure that I also wrote a little plugin that works with the mixer so that the audio the music and also the ambience, which also runs through BAM, ducks when any audio is playing. Yes.
You said that you have to decide which sound fits which other sound, right? So that's why you say this key, I use it with the other ones. Why can't you train AI to do that for you?
Not in 9 months. I can't. I mean, yeah, I think AI is probably going to play a role for people much smarter than me to develop systems like that. But I found that in a lot of cases, yeah, I could come up with some, like I said, music theory maybe, but none of it really made it in the final system because I figured it sounds great sometimes and it sounds horrible most of the time. So yeah, it's really a balance of trying to minimize the configuration that I need to do. So I just tell it these are the keys and I give it some more information like tempo and some other basic stuff. But yeah, really, these are musical decisions, really, and it's sometimes hard enough as a composer to make those decisions.
But then giving well, you don't even need AI to do that. You could also just take your pieces of music and then interpret which key it is,
yeah.
where the key changes and what the tempo is.
Yeah, but even there, if you have a system that knows perfectly well how to musically interpret a segment or a section, even then, it's not always going to sound great, in my experience. So it might be a good starting point, but you'll still have to do some testing and run through it and try some transitions, and you will always find transitions that just do not sound great, and then you just have to tell it, nah, this doesn't work. And maybe AI will at some point be smart enough to pick up on why it doesn't work. That's something that I feel I couldn't verbalize every decision there. AI to the rescue, man. Any other questions? Do we have time? Because I just going. 2 more questions.
A bit of a tough one, and this is not to talk down your system because I have a personal opinion that probably would agree with you. But why didn't you just use F-mod or WISE?
Right. Because when I came on board, the game was not using that. They had their own implementation for their audio already. So we talked about it. But ultimately, it was a joint decision that maybe they didn't really feel like investing time learning how to then also implement the audio, the rest of the audio in one of the existing middleware solutions. So yeah, it was really a combination of having the impression that we were not going to have time for that, and the fact that they were already on a path of a custom implementation anyway. Right. I think, okay, one more.
What's in store for the future? Where do you want to take this sort of BAM?
What's in store for BAM? Currently, I've thought about making it commercial or something, but that's probably not going to happen anytime soon because, like I said, right now, configuration. I don't know if I said that. It's just done by placing tags in the file names. That's not a very user-friendly experience. If you don't know what you're doing, and nobody in the world would know how to do that. Writing an interface, I would estimate that is somewhat usable would probably be easily 2 years of work. And well, that's not the kind of future that I'm looking forward to right now. So I will be using it as a custom solution in future games. But for now, it's going to be a custom implementation. All right. Thank you very much.